It's time for another edition of Lewis at Large, 60 minutes of smart talk radio featuring guests from all walks of life in conversation with your host, Warner Lewis. So sit back and lend us your ears for the next hour. Now here with today's first guest is the host of Lewis at Large, Warner Lewis.
Well, welcome everybody to another segment of Lewis at Large. Yours truly, Warner Lewis from the Flight Deck. And as always, of course, that means some smart talk radios in your future. And this segment should be a good conversation indeed. We're going to be talking about Reinventing America's Schools by David Osbourne. Who is David Osbourne? He's the author or co-author of 5 nonfiction books. In the past, he's also published his first historical novel earlier this year called The Coming. He's written for The Atlantic, New York Times Magazine, Washington Post, Mother Jones, etc., etc. He's currently a senior fellow at the Progressive Policy Institute, directing the Reinventing America's Schools project. He lives in the wonderful town of Gloucester, Massachusetts. We are pleased to have him here. David, how are you, my friend?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me.
Well, we're very pleased to have you here. Let's do this. Let's give our Lewis at Large listeners a little bit more background here, if we could. What was the attraction to you as a writer about the American school system?
Well, it's obviously so important. There are a few things that you might argue are more important to our future, like national defense and the environment. But clearly, public education is in the top 3 or 4 things that will determine our future quality of life. And most people know our public school systems have struggled. They probably only work for about half the kids these days. 20% either go to private school or homeschool or charter school. And of the rest, 17% don't graduate. And of the graduates, a third of them, when they go to college, they have to take remedial courses, and a quarter of them get rejected by the armed forces because their education levels aren't high enough. So we have a lot of work to do. And, I discovered that there are cities that have doubled the effectiveness of their public school systems. And so I thought, let's take a look at what they're doing, and maybe other places can learn from them.
As you did research for this, were you negatively surprised, or were you shocked by some of the things that you were finding, or was it pretty much bearing out some sort of theories and ideas you already had?
It did bear out theories I already had. I published a book 25 years ago called Reinventing Government, which was a bestseller at the time in 1992. It described how a new way of running public institutions was emerging to deal with the new realities of the information age. They were more decentralized. They were treating citizens like customers, giving them choices. They were measuring their performance and trying to move the funding to the things that were most effective. They were decentralizing, giving more authority to the people who actually did the work so that they could do a better job of serving the citizens, and a series of other principles. And at the end of that book, when I said, let's take these 10 principles and let's apply them to our 3 biggest domestic problems, one of those was public education. And what emerged was a model in which school districts don't operate the schools themselves. They use 5-year performance contracts with independent, mostly nonprofit organizations to operate the schools. And those organizations have to deliver results to get their contract renewed, and the parents have a choice of schools. The operators are encouraged to create different kinds of learning models for different kinds of kids. And the authority is, the operational decisions are really decentralized so that the people who run the schools can actually make the key decisions about hiring, about firing, about pay structure, about educational model, about the length of the school day, the length of the school year, and so on. So I was kind of convinced by that, and then charter schools emerged, which are pretty much that model. And then, finally, some cities began making charters central to their strategy. New Orleans is the most dramatic. It is now almost 100% charter, and it is the fastest improving city in the country, if not in American history. It's just been dramatic. Washington, D.C. is now up to almost half of the children in charters, and it's another of the fastest improving cities. Denver, the school district, an elected school board in Denver decided a decade ago that some of the charters were really hitting the ball out of the park, and they said, let's just embrace them. Let's give them buildings. Let's try to equalize the funding so charters have as much as traditional schools, and let's just make them part of our strategy. And Denver is another of the fastest improving cities because the charters are so strong. So what's happened has kind of confirmed the view that I had 25 years ago.
David, what about, again, if you would, the term charter school is relatively new. I mean, It's been around for a while, but in the last decade or so. If you would, for our Lewis at Large listeners, give us what is the textbook definition of a charter school versus those of the traditional public schools we're used to thinking of?
So a charter school is a public school, but it is operated by an independent organization. 85% of them are nonprofit organizations, about 15% are for-profit, and frankly, the for-profits don't work very well and have probably been a mistake. But most charter schools are run by nonprofit organizations, and there are two or three big differences with traditional district schools. The first is those running the school actually get to make the decisions. The school has a lot of autonomy. They can hire, they can fire, they can determine their pay scale, they can change their educational model to suit the kids that they have to teach. Second, they're accountable for performance. If the kids are falling behind grade level, then after typically 5 years, although it varies from state to state, that charter won't be renewed. A charter is just a performance contract. It's another word for a performance contract. And it won't be renewed, and the school will either close or be replaced in many cities by a stronger operator in that building. And then the third big difference is that most charter schools are schools of choice rather than neighborhood schools to which kids are assigned. Now, there are exceptions. There are districts that have said, we like the charter model, but our parents want neighborhood elementary schools, so we're going to use charters, some of them as neighborhood schools. But the vast majority are schools of choice.
David, who do the charter schools, who are they responsive to? The parents, the school district? Who do they really answer to, so to speak?
They answer to an authorizer, and, there are now 44 states and the District of Columbia that have charter laws, so this is done differently in different states. Where I live in Massachusetts, the State Board of Education is the authorizer for all charter schools. In Washington, D.C., Congress created a public charter school board that is the authorizer for all charter schools. And in Denver, the school district and the school board is the authorizer. But other states do it differently. Some have really made mistakes and created too many authorizers. But the point is the charter is between an authorizer, which is a public body, sometimes elected, sometimes appointed by elected officials. It's a contract. The charter is a contract between that body and the independent organization that is operating the school. Now, charters are also accountable to parents because if they are schools of choice, the way they are funded is if a family enrolls a child, then the public money for that child, or at least part of it, comes to the school. And then if the parents move the child to another school, the money leaves and goes with the child. So parents have more leverage, and those running charter schools have, let's say, a direct incentive to listen to what parents want, which is not always the case. Certainly wasn't the case with the public schools I attended or my children attended.
Well, if you just joined us, yours truly, Warner Lewis, from the flight deck of Lewis at Large Radio, talking to David Osbourne, a prolific author, not only of nonfiction work, but also worked for New York Times, Washington Post, amongst others. He's currently a senior fellow at the Progressive Policy Institute, directing the Reinventing America's Schools project, a brand new work called Reinventing America's Schools. David, when we think about just schools in general, kids every day on a bus or driven by parents to schools in a classroom, learning 7 to 8 hours a day, a variety of different subjects. Is that educational model still relevant? Are we getting back towards that model more, or are we drifting away from it, particularly in light of more and more homeschooling, more and more online education, et cetera, et cetera?
Well, clearly we're drifting away from it because we have these wonderful new tools. The computer is probably the most powerful learning tool invented since the printing press. And it changes what is possible. So if you go out and look at what's happening in traditional public schools and even more so in chartered public schools, you'll find new models popping up. You'll find schools in which, for example, the kids they learn content by working at a computer and using educational software, and then the teachers mentor them, but the teachers lead projects and seminars rather than just, trying to pour knowledge into the kid. The kid can get the knowledge from working online with educational software. So you do see a lot of change, and the big difference is that the big issue is that the organizational model we use for school districts, where everybody works for the district, everybody's an employee, and we kind of have cookie-cutter schools, we treat all kids the same, that model is over a century old. And in today's world, it really struggles. We need more flexibility, we need more handcrafting, because kids come from different backgrounds, they have different learning styles, they thrive in different environments, so we need different kinds of schools to meet the needs of different kinds of kids. And it's much easier to get that kind of flexibility and creativity and innovation in a system of charter schools, which are independent and have a lot of autonomy, than it is in a traditional district schools where the schools really don't have much autonomy at all. And the principal may be said that he or she runs the school, but often the principal can't hire who they want. They can't fire teachers with tenure. They have no control over the pay scale, and they can't change the educational model in any meaningful way. This new model is producing better results.
In a timeline of American education and the quality, particularly as opposed to suburban versus rural versus inner city schools, how much parity is there, and are the schools becoming more and more on par with one another, or is there an even greater bifurcation maybe than there has been in the past?
Yeah, I think there's greater bifurcation. Everyone knows that, when I was growing up back in the 50s and 60s, we had a growing middle class. Now we have growing inequality, and it feels like a shrinking middle class. And that affects education profoundly. The most important factor in how a student does in school is their parents and their family. There's no question about that. So if income is becoming more unequal, then opportunity for kids becomes more unequal. So what we're seeing typically is that our suburban schools it's not that they're great, but they're not a big problem area. It's in the big cities with a lot of poor kids, where the schools are really struggling, and where most of the charter schools are located, because they were created to help those kids. So you're right. Overall, we're moving in a direction of less equality, less equal opportunity, and this whole charter school movement is an effort to try to reverse that.
Right. Do this for just a minute. I want to put you on the other side of the aisle.
Okay.
What would be the argument or the case, the traditional case against, so to speak, charter schools?
Well, what you hear the most is that they're privatization, and somehow that is evil. But what people don't realize is that probably at least half of our public services are delivered by private organizations. We all know Obamacare is a public program, right? But the services are delivered by private doctors and hospitals. Same with Medicare. Same with Medicaid. The same with Head Start for young children. That's a public program, publicly funded, but the services are mostly delivered by nonprofit organizations. You look at your roads and your highways. Who builds those? Private companies. Who maintains them? Repairs them? Mostly private companies. So the norm in the information age has become that the public sector spends the money and contracts with private operators to get the services done. And yet when we do that in education, it's attacked as privatization and somehow un-American. That would be the biggest criticism.
What about, again, let's talk now about the parents. If a parent is pushing for or chooses a private school, or a charter school, what do you tell them? What do they need to know?
Well, they need to know what the school model is. That is, there are so many different kinds of schools. There are Montessori schools. There are dual language immersion schools. There are STEM schools, science, technology, engineering, and math. There are performing arts schools. There are just a lot of models. They have to understand the model, and they need to know what are the kids' test scores like, how much academic growth are they making, what's the graduation rate if it's a high school, what's the attendance rate, how many disciplinary problems are there, and what do parents say about the school on a survey? What are parental attitudes about the school? So those are all useful pieces of information, and the authorizer or school district needs to make that information available to parents and needs to have places where parents can go if, for example, they don't speak English well, or if they only got a sixth grade education themselves and really need help figuring out what all this information needs. They need some place to go where they can sit down with a counselor who can help them, who can help walk them through all of that information.
One of the things that you referenced in the book was a term called innovation schools. Can you put a little bit sharper point on that?
Sure. A lot of districts have looked at the success of charter schools and said, wow, let's try to do some of that, but without rocking the boat too much. So, for example, in Denver, the district went to the state legislature and got a law passed to allow them to create innovation schools, which essentially, if they put together an innovation plan and the teachers vote for it, they can get waivers to a lot of district and state rules. They can even waive the collective bargaining agreement and essentially step outside the teachers' union. And they now have, more than 50 of these innovation schools. There are different kinds of models in different places, and I've studied this, and typically they perform a little bit better than traditional public schools because they have more autonomy, but they don't perform as well as charter schools. And that seems to be, again, we don't know, it's not science, but it seems to be because they don't have as much autonomy and they also don't have the same accountability. One of the key things about a charter is that every adult in the building knows that if there are problems that are affecting student learning, if they don't solve them, the school might close, and they all might be out of a job. So it creates urgency and a willingness to work together, the principal, the management, the teachers, working together to solve whatever the problems are and make the tough decisions they need to make. That doesn't typically exist in innovation schools, and I think it's a very important factor in why charters have produced better results.
Well, undoubtedly, like with all institutions, some of these charter schools will not be as prolific and may actually fail. What about, when you're monitoring that kind of progress, how do you make sure that the results that are desired are happening?
Well, you measure test scores, you measure graduation rates, you measure attendance rates, you survey parents to get their opinions about the quality of the school, and if you're smart, and a lot of good authorizers do this, you visit the school every year. You have some seasoned experts spend some time in the school and do a qualitative assessment. And then if you do all of that, you've got a pretty good idea of whether the school is excellent, good, mediocre, or failing. And we really should replace all failing public schools with stronger schools, shouldn't we? I mean, isn't that what we owe our children? And that, unfortunately, doesn't happen in most traditional school districts. It's beginning to in some. There is a lot of change afoot, but it does happen in most charter sectors. Now, not all. There are states like Ohio and Michigan where authorizers have done a terrible job and don't close most failing schools. And in those states, the charters don't perform a whole lot better than the traditional public schools. So that willingness to make the tough decision and is important. But in these cities that have a lot of charters, you don't have to just close the school. You can replace the operator, keep the building, just put an operator that's proven that they're successful into that building to start, in essence, a new school with a new staff.
Well, David, as we start to kind of wind down here, as a result of the research and just the work that you do, as you look towards the future, are you optimistic? Are you pessimistic? Where are you? Where's David Osbourne's attitude now about the next, let's say, decade of American education?
That's a great question. I have both feelings, optimism and pessimism, depending on the day. I'm optimistic because we now have proof that this new model really works. New Orleans, Washington, D.C., Denver, Indianapolis, and we see it spreading. You've now got Memphis and Camden, New Jersey, and you've got cities like Cleveland and San Antonio beginning on this journey, beginning to create what I call a 21st century school system where they use performance contracts or charters with independent operators to operate some of their schools. So it is spreading. The pessimism is that the teachers' unions are dead set against it because, frankly, most charter schools are not unionized. Most of the teachers in charter schools want to be treated like professionals, not like industrial workers. And a lot of them have a lot of, some of them are teacher leaders where they mentor other teachers. Others are deans. Teachers have a lot of leadership roles in many of these charter schools, and they just don't, the unions can unionize them, but they're not interested. So the unions look at this and they realize as charters grow, we're going to shrink. And so they fight them every place they can, and that can be very discouraging. So I think we'll see stop-and-go progress as those political battles continue. But 10 years from now, I think you'll see a lot more cities using this 21st century approach.
Well, the work is called Reinventing America's Schools by David Osbourne, a prolific author, and this is obviously a subject of which he's very passionate about. David, appreciate your time today and your insights on this. How can people find out more about the work that you do, some of your writings? Also, maybe grab a copy of the book.
Well, they can go to our website, which is www.progressivepolicy.org, and find my writings. And they can order the book or buy the book at Amazon or Barnes & Noble or any brick-and-mortar bookstore. And if the bookstore doesn't have it, they can just ask that it be ordered. So it's out there.
All right. Well, listen, again, thanks so much, and would love to have you back on again, and thanks for your time today.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
You bet. We'll be back with more right after this on Lewis at Large.